We're good.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm glad you could join us this afternoon. My name is Vicky, and I'm the program coordinator with the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. With me here today is also my colleague Emily, and we have three guest speakers here today as well. Claudette Sims, who say hello, Rick Gray, and Sean Booth as well. Today's uh, today's webinar is titled Grow Me Instead, Promoting Invasive-free Gardening Across Ontario. The intent of today's talk will be to go over how you can get started on native gardening and avoid invasive plants in your garden. I'll begin by providing a brief overview of the OIPC's Grow Me Instead guide. We also have we also we'll go over some of our guest speakers. We'll go over the benefits of native gardening, how to attract wildlife to your garden, and how to propagate and grow native plants. This webinar is also going to be recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. All three guest speakers will then join us for the Q&A panel at the end. If you have any questions at all throughout the webinar, just put them in the chat and we'll review them at the end. And before we dive in, I'd love to know more about who's joining us today. So feel free to put your name and your organization. What makes you interested in learning more about invasive-free gardening? And I also wanted to acknowledge that we're gathered here today from across the traditional territories of Canada's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I'd like to acknowledge the role of our Indigenous peoples as stewards of this land and to thank them for their teachings. And with that, before we get started, I wanted to turn things to Emily for a couple housekeeping items.
Awesome. Thanks, Vicky. So really quick, this webinar has been approved for a couple continuing education opportunities. So we have the International Society for Arboriculture 1.5 CECs are available for the live version of this webinar only. I'll be putting a link to a attendee sheet in the chat in a second, and you can just fill in your information there, and then I will submit that so you can get those CECs. Next slide, Vicky. So we also have approved for the Society for Ecological Restoration's Certified Ecological Restoration Practitioner Program. There's one CEC available for this webinar as well. I'll just have you fill in the attendee sheets that I will put in the chat in a second here. Next slide, Vicky. And then finally, just to really quickly mention, we do have four other upcoming webinars. We'll have an introduction to invasive plants that'll be happening on June 19th, a dog strangling vine best management practices webinar that'll be happening on June 17th. We'll have a guest speaker who will talk about a project in Tommy Thompson Park in Toronto. Then we'll have a razor water milfoil webinar as well. We haven't confirmed the date, but that one will be in August. Then finally, we'll have a really short webinar on prescribed grazing in the Don Valley Park, Brickworks Park in Toronto. We will have a guest speaker for that one as well. Registration for these webinars is not open yet, but we do announce our webinars through our email list as well as on our social media, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Vicky, and I'm going to put the links for the chat to those CEC sign-in sheets.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Okay, so I wanted to start with a quick background on the OIPC. So we're a nonprofit organization whose mandate is to provide a coordinated provincial response to the growing threat of invasive plants. We provide leadership, expertise, and a forum to engage and empower Ontarians to take action on invasive plant issues. And now we are also a chapter under Invasives Canada, formerly called Canadian Council on Invasive Species. This is a national nonprofit organization comprised of provincial chapters across Canada that work together to build practical solutions to prevent the spread of invasive species. So it's good to begin with a definition of what an invasive species is. We define an invasive species as one that's been introduced from another geographic region to an area outside its natural range. Its presence has negative impacts to the environment, economy, and society. This matters because invasive species are the second most significant cause of species extinction worldwide after habitat loss. And in Ontario, we have the most invasive species compared to other provinces. This is mainly because we are at higher risk of invasions because of the number of urbanized areas, degraded habitats, and our geographic location. One of the primary pathways of spread of invasive plants is the horticultural pathway, which we're going to be focusing on today. The horticulture and nursery trades are the primary pathway for invasive species introductions, responsible for at least 31% of all invasions globally. 85% of all non-native woody plants in North America were introduced through the landscape trade. While most are harmless garden additions, some can escape cultivation and then become problematic in natural areas. The OIPC has a great guide called the Grow Me Instead Guide that helps to address the horticultural pathway of spread by educating gardeners on how to choose native, non-invasive alternatives for their garden. This resource is available for free download on our website. We have a Southern Ontario guide, one in French, and a guide for Northern Ontario as well. By planting native species in your garden, you can play a huge role in promoting pollinator habitat and in turn supporting local populations of insects and other wildlife. And I really love this quote here that if something is not eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem. So it is really a shift in mentality when you start planting native versus the more traditional ways people garden. And next, I wanted to give a few examples of unwanted and alternative species that are in these guides. Our guest speakers, Rick and Sean, will dive into a couple more species later on. So miscanthus or Chinese silvergrass is a really common uh, ornamental grass that is commonly planted and then escapes along roadsides and becomes invasive. It's kind of similar to invasive Phragmites. It grows aggressively through its rhizomes and displaces native species. It also decomposes slowly on the ground, so it limits the amount of nutrients that are then returned to the soil. It also is a fire hazard when it dries out, much like Phragmites, and it reduces light availability to native plants. One good alternative, if you have the space, is big blue stem. This is a tall grass that reaches up to 7 feet tall with deep roots, and it's great for erosion control. It's also great for prairie and meadow gardens, intermixed with wildflower species or on rooftop gardens. Because of its height, songbirds find shelter and food within this grass. The seed pods are blue, green, and sprig and turn a rich orange coppery red in the fall, so it's quite a beautiful grass. Norway maple is an invasive tree that's quite a familiar sight across many urban centers in southern Ontario. It was once planted widely in cities and towns after World War II as a replacement for white elms that were decimated by Dutch elm disease. It has many desirable characteristics as an urban street tree, like being able to withstand pollution to a degree and withstand compacted soils. But unfortunately, it escapes into natural areas where it can drastically alter the composition of our forests over a long period of time. This can take hundreds of years to see. Being a tree, it's still relatively slow growing in its life, and results are not immediate. But unfortunately, it has no positive relationships with pollinators and native animals, and it essentially has a top-down effect because it trees, once the Norway maple really forms a forest, it's a very dense shaded tree and it can outshade many species in the canopy, creating a barren landscape of reduced biodiversity. Native maples are good potential alternatives to Norway maple. These include sugar maple, silver maple, Freeman maple, and red maple. These can be good alternatives, but you do need to know the site species suitability for growing at a particular site. Some, for example, like sugar maple, don't tolerate urban soils very well. However, native maples are well adapted to the climate, requiring less maintenance than non-native options while providing benefits to wildlife. Next is winged euonymus. This is a very common shrub in people's gardens. It's also known as burning bush because it has this brilliant leaf color in the fall when it's most noticeable. It's a woody, multi-stem deciduous shrub with unique stems and beautiful berries. Many are surprised to learn it's invasive, but birds often carry the seeds into natural areas. Here is an example of one winged euonymus that has escaped into a forest in Orangeville. When they escape into wooded lots, they typically tend to turn a more pinkish color than the brilliant red in more open, sunny areas. And Winged euonymus, unfortunately, and other potential invasive euonymus species continue to be popular and widely available in nurseries and as landscape ornamentals. An alternative is fragrant sumac. This is a good drought-tolerant shrub that establishes easily and requires little maintenance. It can grow quite thick and intertwined. It has yellow summer blooms that attract bumblebees and hummingbirds for pollination, and then the female flowers turn into clusters of hairy red berries that have this sweet lemon scent in the summer. They're quite attractive berries as well. And the leaves also in the fall turn a brilliant red, orange, and purple. So it's really quite a beautiful shrub. So that covers a few species examples, and I just wanted to touch on how invasive species can spread into natural areas. So there's naturally just natural pathways when seeds or small rhizome fragments are dispersed in the water, or seeds are dispersed by wind or latch onto animals like our pets and wildlife. Also, man-made pathways like roads, horticulture, recreational boating, and firewood movement, which is a big one for movement of various invasive pest insects and fungi. Um, and this is the man-made pathways are some of the major pathways for longer distance spread, like hundreds of kilometers away. One of the major pathways of spread for invasive garden plants is through the improper disposal of garden waste. When people pile brush and dump their garden waste into natural areas, it provides ample opportunity for invasives to spread. So I wanted to show an example of a brush pile that's created near my neighborhood right on top of a river ravine. And the result has been many invasives have spread into the ravine over the years. And here's one example of goutweed that has spread a little bit more downstream from that pile. And it's really just covering this entire area and preventing any other native species from growing, and essentially creates an ecological desert because most native wildlife, native insects can't then feed on these goutweed leaves. The best way to dispose of especially invasive plant material, if you have seeds or roots, rhizomes, is to solarize it and not to backyard compost, because backyard composting really doesn't reach that temperatures high enough necessary to kill the seeds or the roots. So instead, it's best to place the material in a black plastic bag, or you can tarp it with a black tarp if you have a larger amounts. For the bags, you would seal them tightly and then leave them in direct sunlight for at least a week, and then discard the plant material at a regular landfill, or you can burn it if you're allowed in your area. And then lastly, learn how to report and recognize invasive species. If you have an invasive species or another species you'd like to identify, these are some great reporting tools. Edmaps.org. You can go to the Ontario Invading Species Awareness Program has a great hotline that you can call. And iNaturalist is also a great resource for any kind of species if you want help with ID. The best for this is really early detection. So if you think you found a species that might even be new to Ontario or new to a specific location, its range is expanding, these are really great tools for helping scientists get a sense of how invasive species are spreading over time. And if you're interested in learning more, again, you can visit our website. You can download our best practices and other resources or our Grow Me Instead guides. And feel free to reach me if you have any questions. So with that, I'd love to introduce Claudette Sims and introduce her to the stage. Hi, Claudette. So while she's sharing her screen, I'll just read her bio here. So Claudette joined the Master Gardeners of Ontario in 2004 and served as president for 6 years. She was a regular panelist and lead on the weekly CBC radio program Chat, and has subbed in for Ed Lawrence on Radio Thrilling. but scary experience. Claudette is currently the admin for a very successful Master Gardeners of Ontario Facebook group and works with a great team of master gardeners and garden experts to provide reliable science-based gardening advice to the public. This forum continues to grow and is now approaching 58,000 members. She and Kathy Cavasalis are the co-founders of the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation, which aims to stop the sale of high-risk invasive plants that harm biodiversity. She loves to attract wildlife to her garden, and her most recent passion is adding larval host plants for butterflies and native plants to support specialist bees. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. That was a great introduction to invasive plants. I loved it. Thank you for inviting me to talk about invasive-free gardening across Ontario. And I want to remind everyone that a garden isn't just a backdrop, it's actually an ecosystem that can support and nourish you and support wildlife and help the planet. The plants that you choose can make a difference. And as Vicki has mentioned, most invasive plants were first introduced as ornamental garden plants. And what people don't know is that many of these plants are still sold in nurseries because most of our regulations around plants focus on agriculture rather than on horticulture, which is the primary pathway for the introduction of invasive plants. So I want everyone today to access their superpowers. I am wearing my cape, my superhero cape, and I've got my Master Gardener superhero logo on because I want your help in stopping the spread of invasive plants. I'm not here to shame or blame anyone because many of us have had or have had invasive plants in their garden. This is about increasing awareness, and it's a journey. The journey begins by understanding that on our planet, life is disappearing. Almost half the planet's species are experiencing rapid population declines, and the variety of life is diminishing on the planet. We are currently in an insect apocalypse. They have declined by 45% globally in only 35 years, which is just a blink of an eye, really, in ecological terms. Flying insects are down 70%. Why is this important? Well, insects are the little things that run the world. That's how E.O. Wilson described them. They are our pollinators. They are the insects that work the soil, etc. They are essential not only for our ecosystems, but for people as well. The collapse of insects in part has contributed to the decline of birds in North America. We have lost almost 3 billion birds since 1970. That is an amazing number of birds. So you can be a superhero just by the simple act of gardening. In the past, we have tended to focus on aesthetics when we are gardening. We selected plants for their appearance. We didn't even think of what country they came from. Oftentimes, plants were planted individually as an accent in a garden, and they were planted with no common soil moisture preferences. When we did garden maintenance, it was largely driven by appearance, again, by aesthetics. So we talked about spring cleanup or fall cleanup, and we used mulch as if it was like some beautiful feature in a garden when it really should not be. These kinds of gardens have significant resource inputs or require them, such as water, pesticides to keep the garden going, and fertilizer. In contrast, native plant gardening focuses on ecosystem supports. We tend to plant a community of plants that are chosen for their ecosystem functions. These plants in my front garden require minimum fertilizer and water. In fact, they don't require any water because except for new plantings, because the roots are so deep. As far as management is concerned, the management supports nature, not aesthetics. So I leave the stems, I leave the leaves for the soil. I choose the plants based on their pollen, nectar, foliar, fruit resources, and their seeds. I try to have plants that bloom from spring to fall. And then through the winter, I leave the plants intact so that birds can access them not only for food, for the seeds inside, but sometimes for the little critters that are in there, and also for shelter. So a native plant garden supports native bees, insects, animals, and birds. And I just want to make a comment because we're at the end of April and we're going to be coming into no mow May season, where you're going to see all kinds of social media posts for, let's leave the dandelions because that saves the honeybees. Want to make very clear that gardening for honeybees doesn't save our wild bees any more than keeping backyard chickens saves wild birds. So make sure that's clear. So we need to talk a little bit about the co-evolved functional relationships. I love this particular definition by Lorraine Johnson, a well-known Canadian author. She says native plants are species that evolved in association with all the features of a place and developed specific and important functional relationships and interactions that contribute to that specificity and entity and identity of the place. So I've talked for a long time about plants that are made in Canada and made in Ontario. And as a shopper, I tend to look for things that are made in Canada or Ontario because I know that oftentimes the quality is superior and the people who make those things are well paid, hopefully, and they contribute to our society with their taxes. They support our education and our medical industry. So in the same way, plants that are native to Ontario or to your ecoregion support this very varied ecosystem. Let's take a closer look at what this means. I think we're all familiar with the monarch caterpillar and the milkweed. This is an example of species that evolved in association, but let's think beyond just this one iconic individual, because milkweed, nectar, leaves, seed pods, and stems support a whole host of species. This entire list from short-tongue, long-tongue bees, right down to gulls. All of these little animals feed on milkweed, and in turn, they support really complex food webs that feed on them. They are all supposed to be on the milkweed. They are part of our native ecosystem. Have you ever looked at the stems of milkweed? I was puzzling over this last year and noticed these very fibrous parts of milkweed. It wasn't until I watched this video from Brooklyn Bridge Park by Rebecca McMacken that I saw a bird on the milkweed and it was stripping the filaments. That was to build the nests. That same spring, I noticed that the Baltimore Orioles in our yard were on my milkweed plants and they were stripping the filaments. This is one of those functional relationships because the Baltimore Oriole likes those stringy filaments to build its hanging nest. So not only the plants matter, but your cultural practices matter. So make sure you leave your stems standing long enough for native bees to nest and emerge. And make sure you leave leaves for birds and insects. Because we know that native plants support these very specific and functional relationships. Half the insects we have are herbivores, the other half just eat other bugs. 70% of those herbivores are capable of feeding only on a narrow range of plants, and those are native plants. About 25% of our bees are pollen specialists. So like these two little Andrena bees, these minor bees, they require dogwood pollen. Or the evening primrose sweat bee has legs that have evolved to collect pollen only from the evening primrose. So if there's no evening primrose, there's no evening primrose sweat bee. These are those specific and functional relationships. We also have bees and other insects that have evolved so that their timing is in timing with plants. So trout lily blooms in March, April, May, and that's when the Andrena bee emerges from the soil and will go foraging for pollen so that it can then lay eggs and start the cycle over again. The cycle of the trout lily supports the cycle of the Andrena bee. So how does this work with invasive plants? How do they disrupt these relationships? Well, if you look around your neighborhood or you go to parks, you might see Scillas iberica flowering everywhere. This is a photo from Oxford County, and the same person reported this plant flowering in Point Pelee. You will find this flowering on front lawns everywhere. It seems kind of innocuous because it's there now and then it disappears. So how does this plant really stop other plants? How does it affect biodiversity? Well, Kathy's created this great infographic which leads you through the steps. So she first asks, is the species outside of its natural distribution area due to human activities? And yes, it is. Scillas iberica comes from Eastern Europe. it has spread to the areas in purple. Second question you ask yourself is, does the introduction or spread of this threaten the environment, the economy, society, or human health? Well, often we have focused on plants that affect agriculture, but this is a plant that has very rapid growth and reproduction. It has the ability to outcompete other native plants. So where the scilla are growing, you're not going to see trout lilies, you're not going to see trilliums, you're not going to see hepaticas because they have been crowded out. And the other question to ask yourself, is there a lack of natural control? Well, yes, because there's no herbivores that will browse this plant because it contains toxic alkaloids, which inhibit that. There are so many other invasive plants like lily of the valley and periwinkle, which are also toxic to mammalian species. So this makes the situation even worse. So a little plant like trout lily cannot grow in these conditions, and therefore we lose that one species. Both trout lily and Scilla severica kind of disappear in the spring once the summer gets started. So you might think that, this affects nothing, but it affects lots of things because the plant species support both species above ground and in the soil. And we know that those species support other species and other species. So losing one species of bee has a cascading effect where all of the food web, we lose all kinds of other plants. And we rarely talk about plants that are creatures that are in our soil because we don't know a lot about them. We're just learning about symbionts and mycorrhizal associations and little predators that are there. We know that invasive plants actually alter the soil to make it advantageous for them. This is even worse when we look at really high functioning plants like these, which support really complex food webs. Trees like oaks, cherries, and willows, which support hundreds and hundreds of species, perennials like goldenrods, asters, strawberries, and sunflowers, which again support close to 100 species each. Doug Ptolemy calls these keystone plants because, like a keystone in an arch, they support complex food webs. So your garden has the potential to hinder or support biodiversity, depending on which plants you choose. So invasive plants on the left create dead zones. They support invasive insects. Non-native plants maybe don't do any harm, but they kind of take up space because they wind up, I see them now as like plastic plants because they don't support very much. When you start adding native plants, a lot of people start with cultivars. So make sure that you ask yourself when you look at the cultivar, has the flower been changed because it may not have pollen? Has the leaf been changed because it may no longer be palatable to insect species? So you're always best to choose straight species, and of the straight species, try and concentrate on keystone plants because they are critical to our food webs. 14% of key native plant groups support 90% of butterflies and moths. Without these powerhouse plants that support caterpillars, our food webs are doomed. So how can we create this beautiful invasive-free garden that supports biodiversity? Well, here are some ideas and also some challenges. First of all, you have to know what's invasive. SIPR has the most comprehensive list of invasive plants that you'll find anywhere on our website. You can also look at invasive plant lists from conservation authorities. I happen to like the credit value one because it's very robust, very well researched, and it includes Scilla, which a lot of the other ones just don't have on their lists. You can also look at the Auditor General of Ontario's list of 28 plants which should not be planted in Ontario. That's a good one. But I love these Grow Me Instead guides, and I've added here the Salt Algoma guide, which they created. And apologies for leaving out the French guide here. But I love them because they focus on the species sold in horticulture, which we know that's the issue. But there's lots of other resources as well. The two resources on the left talk about water plants. Sometimes our neighbors to the south have excellent suggestions, especially our border states. I love to grow butterflies in my garden. So not by using butterfly bush, but by using shrubs and plants that actually grow butterflies, not just feed them nectar. And then I do like the Xerces Society list of beneficial insects because those plants will attract insects that will then keep your garden in balance and you won't need pesticides. If you want to be happier, attract birds to your garden because we know that the greater bird diversity can bring greater joy, even more than money. So hearing birds song and seeing birds makes people happy. If you want to know what kind of plants are native to your ecoregion, the Forest Gene Conservation Association is an excellent resource. You can click on the pin that reflects your area and it will pop up these PDFs. This one is of ecoregion 6E and 6E. Uh, 6E6, and I've circled that here are the black cherries and oaks, and on the right hand side, the prunus, the cherry species. Those are your keystone species, which you should start with. I also just found that Birds Canada has posted this website. You can put in where you live. So I put in Oromodonte. I was doing a presentation for them last week. And it tells you then that you're in zone number 17 and that your zone name is the Eastern Great Lakes Valley Lowland Forest. And what I love is it has this function which allows you to search. So I put in trees, I put in that we're zone 17, and I put in the features that I wanted and that I wanted berries and nectar for birds. And it popped up with all kinds of great resources that would be suited to your garden because matching the plant with your garden conditions will ensure success. One challenge sometimes is when you go to the native plant nursery, invasive plants are sold in flats and they're very, very cheap, whereas native plants are sometimes sold as small pots or plugs, take a long time to establish, and they cost a lot of money. So one alternative is to grow native plants from seed. Many of them are very easy, and I think Rick and Sean are going to talk about that. And then when you're transitioning away from invasive plants, where do you start? Well, look at your garden, decide how plants spread. If they spread by seeds, cut those flowers off right away and dispose of them safely, as Vicky has said. If they spread by rhizomes, start in the outside, the invasion front, and work your way in. If you have mature invasive plants like a Norway maple, that's a hard decision to make. Some people will opt to remove it because it continues to damage the ecosystem. Other people might want to limb it up and underplant it with young trees and shrubs. And of course, you have to follow the regulations of your municipality with regard to mature trees. In my garden, I'm trying to get rid of this euonymus, which I created this beautiful arch over the fence, and I've replaced it with a native clematis and a climbing hydrangea. So as these plants grow bigger, I trim down the other one. Then when you've removed an invasive plant, especially something like periwinkle, English ivy, you have to monitor constantly, sometimes for 5 or more years, and then replant always as soon as possible with non-invasive plants. And gardeners are so kind. When you remove invasive plants, please don't gift them and please don't sell them at plant sales. So some of you may be wondering, where do I start? I don't want to get rid of my delphiniums. Well, delphiniums they're okay. They're fine, but you change things one plant at a time. So maybe in that row in front of your delphiniums, you have an invasive plant. Remove that and add golden alexanders, which is a fantastic plant. It blooms in the spring, so it extends your blooming season. It attracts beneficial insects, which may help your delphiniums, and it is the host plant for the black swallowtail. Or add ironweed, a really tall sculptural plant, which will add pollen resources, nectar resources. It'll add structure to your garden. It'll make your garden beautiful. And it is the host plant for the American painted lady. I added blue stem goldenrod to my garden. I removed a hosta and I added that. And I love the texture that this adds. And now it adds more function because goldenrod is a keystone plant. Whereas hostas they're pretty well just plastic plants at this point. They don't really add very much. And that's why there's usually so few holes in them because nothing eats them. When you're adding plants to your garden, try and prioritize shrubs and trees because they build structure in your garden and they provide the shelter. So the Grow Me Instead guide had lots of great choices. And I love they have lindera and buttonbush in here. I love my redbud because it just is buzzing with insects in the spring. And once I see these little cuts in the leaves, I know that the leafcutter bees have arrived, and it just brings so much joy. Last fall, I saw a stick bug for the first time in maybe 30 years on my redbud. This absolutely sparked joy in my life. My lindera is beautiful in the spring, so much better than a forsythia, which supports 0 species. This one supports 2 beautiful butterflies and an absolutely amazing looking moth as well. And then it supports birds in the fall by having these berries. You just need to have a male and a female plant for this. Love my button bush if you have the right conditions for it. It attracts so many butterflies and has super resources. I took the photo on the bottom left one night, and because white plants tend to attract moths, and I was just stunned to see these two moths doing their thing, and you could actually see like the nectar dripping from this bush. It's an excellent pollen resource. Plants that you choose make a difference, but also how you plant them makes a huge difference. So oak trees support lots of species, but a lot of those species have to drop down from the tree to the ground, and they have to go into the soil to complete their life cycle. So if you have lawn under your tree, it tends to stop those critters from going into the soil. So replace your lawn with ground covers or with shrubs. This will allow those insects to fall from the ground and complete their life cycle. So you will have fireflies, bumblebees, beetles, and lacewings in your garden. There are lots of shrubs or lots of plants that are suggested as ground covers in the Grow Me Instead guide, and they are all absolutely stunning. So look at this wild ginger on the bottom and the ferns there. The cinnamon fern in the top left. If you plant that in your garden, not only will you have a beautiful native plant, but hummingbirds use the fertile frond scales to build their nests. Don't let anyone tell you you can't grow anything under a mature black walnut, because that is creeping phlox growing under a mature walnut. Don't forget sedges, amazing plants. And why are we not growing more trilliums in our gardens? There are, I think, 5 trilliums that are native to Ontario. Make sure that your cultural practices also, with regard to things, you follow them correctly. We tend to use this language where we're saying that leaves are litter, or there's garden detritus, or we're doing this cleanup. We have to get away from using that that kind of terminology, because Mother Nature creates those things for a purpose. It's to build soil health, to insulate tree roots, to reduce water loss, etc. So we should be rejoicing in those things, not calling them litter. Keep your garden buzzing all year long by choosing native plants, match the plants with your growing conditions, include a diversity of species, prioritize trees and shrubs in your garden if you can. Try to get perennials that bloom from early spring to late fall. Choose a variety of flower shapes, colors, and sizes. That will promote the most benefits in your garden. Don't forget native grasses and sedges, which are sometimes forgotten. I didn't mention about aggressive native species, something like a Canada anemone that people maybe hesitate to plant. Get your native plant garden established and then add something aggressive, a native plant species that will be held in check by the plants that are already established. Doug Ptolemy tells us that we want to aim for 70% native plants in a garden by biomass. So planting just one oak tree might get you there. And of course, remove invasive plants. Don't forget to choose plants that are native to Ontario and be proud of that heritage and keep your garden buzzing, because these are the reasons that I garden. These things spark joy in my life and they just keep me going. Thank you very much. Check out our Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation. We have so many resources there. Follow us on Facebook. I try and post as much information as there. And thank you for helping us make a difference. Thank you for all the Master Gardeners that I saw who joined, and make sure you do use your superpowers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudette. That was an amazing presentation, full of great information and very informative. I love that cinnamon fern too. And I didn't realize you were wearing a superhero cape.
Yeah, I got I don't know if you probably can't see it, but it says, I'm a master gardener. What's your
Ah,
superpower? I made it
absolutely.
years ago. It's
That's
getting a lot
great.
of wear these days. And I encourage all master gardeners to use those logos, and all of those images created by Kathy are on our Facebook page. Feel free to use them. I use them to promote nurseries. Vandermeer's just recently said that they were not going to sell a whole bunch of invasive plants. So I put the superhero thing on their website or on their Facebook page to encourage them, because we need more of that. And we are seeing change, Vicki. So good news.
Yeah, that is good news. And I think that native gardening is increasing in popularity, definitely. Awesome. So with that, I'd love to introduce Rick Gray and Sean Booth. So Rick Gray has been an avid gardener since the 1960s. In 2006, he discovered native plant gardening and never looked back. With a background in environmental sciences, an undergrad in natural resources management, and a master's degree in environmental biology, Rick spent many years teaching the environment program at the University of Guelph's Ridgetown campus. He went on to become the academic chair of the Horticulture, Agriculture, and Environmental Management program at Assiniboine College in Brandon, Manitoba, followed by a stint as academic chair at Fleming College's School of Natural Resources in Lindsay, Ontario. In 2018, Rick retired to play in his half-acre garden full-time, where he tends to over 300 species of native flowers, grasses, ferns, shrubs, and trees. His garden has been part of several organized garden tours in recent years, and he's the principal author of the Globe and Mail bestseller, The Gardener's Guide to Native Plants of the Southern Great Lakes region, which we'll talk about more today. And then also going to welcome Sean Booth, who's the owner of In Our Nature, a natural garden design firm and native plant nursery based out of Alton, Ontario. Sean is on a mission to change the way we see our gardens by empowering gardeners to invite nature back into their lives through natural garden design. As a co-author of the Globe and Mail best-selling book, The Gardener's Guide to Native Plants of the Southern Great Lakes region, Sean brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to design projects. His approach to garden design increases biodiversity and reduces maintenance, all without sacrificing beauty. He's the founder of the Ontario Native Plant Gardening Facebook group with over 38,000 members and regularly posts free resources and guides on his website, inournature.ca. Welcome.
Thanks. Uh, Let me know if you can see that yet.
Not yet, just give it a minute. I see Zoom. I think they shared the wrong.
Okay. Um, Get rid of that. And where did it go? All right.
You could try reopening it maybe to get that one.
I see it on my screen.
There we
Okay.
go. I see it.
Are we up?
Yeah, great.
Awesome. Okay. Now I have to find it so I can see it. There we go. All right. Okay. We're in business. Uh, Thanks so much, Vicky and Claudette. That was quite an act to follow. I'm hoping that Sean and I can live up to your standards. Uh, so, what I want to talk about today and what Sean and I are going to do is we're going to look a bit at why native plants are important, but just very briefly. A lot of that was covered already. And then I want to walk you through about our book. And I've got a shameless plug here for our book, but I'm going to explain why we created the book and what benefits it has for you growing native plants. And then Sean's going to take over and he's going to do the hard work because he's going to tell you how to propagate your own native plants from seed. And then I'll wrap it up at the end as well with a bit of a summary and look at a few pictures of beautiful plants that you can grow instead of invasives. So one of the important things to note is that 90% of our insects only develop and reproduce on plants, which they share an evolutionary history. In other words, on native plants. And 90% of our plants require insect pollinators. If we don't have pollinators, we don't have plants. And since we require plants to eat, it's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. So this image here, this shows a bunch of insects at the bottom, which are the food for birds, mice, frogs, and so on. And those in turn become food for things like snakes and foxes and etc. Um, and one of the things this graphic doesn't show, though, is that foxes also have about 25% of their diet is insects. And snakes, I know many of the small snakes, a major part of their diet is insects. I just couldn't find any actual stats on it. Um, and so if we are missing, whoops, if we're missing all of those insects at the bottom, then we're going to miss everything going up the food chain. We're going to have no food for the top predators, whether those be hawks or large predatory mammals. Uh, those need the insects to support the life that they need in order to survive. No insects simply means no birds, no mammals, no fish, etc. And so one of the things that we have to do is make sure we have the food for those insects to keep the whole food web going. So what plants should I grow? Well, we've got lots and lots of choices. One of the things that got me into native plants in the first place was just the sheer beauty of these plants. And why do you need to go to a nursery and buy some exotic plant when we have so much beauty here right in our own backyard that belongs here? And so these are just a few pictures from my own garden of various all native species. And the image, let's see if I can bring my pointer up. Uh, Laser pointer. So this plant here, if you can see that circling, that is wild bergamot. And when that plant is in bloom, that is the busiest plant in my entire garden. I've counted well over a dozen species of bees from the size of a grain of rice up to large bumblebees on it. I've had moths and butterflies. I've had clearwing hummingbird, clearwing moth on it quite regularly. That plant alone is worth growing if you don't grow anything else in your garden. Um, so where do I start? Well, get my mouse back over here. There we go. We have tons of great native plant nurseries in Ontario. Uh, these blue dots on this map show all the places that either exclusively grow native species or they promote natives within their other plants as well. And you can find this information either at bit.ly Rick's NP sources or on my website, nativeplantgardener.ca. And you can go in and click on those dots on the map and it'll give you the website for it, and their address and so on, whatever other information I could pull together for them. So great place to start looking for plants. Doug Tallamy's names come up. These two books here are among my top 10 books. These are so important to explain why we grow what we grow, more so than anything else. And I understand that he now has a new book that's just come out this month called How Can I Help? It's on my wish list. I don't have a copy yet, but I'm sure I will have before long. Then, if you want to know which plants to grow, Lorraine Johnson, whose name's already come up, these two books here were among the very first books I bought when I got into growing natives. And they are excellent. But a couple of years ago, she came out with this book, A Garden for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. And I'm sure many people watching this video already have that book. I like to tell people that it's probably the second best book on growing native plants. And why is that? Well, I'm a bit biased because this is our book. Sean and I put this together. It was a labor of love. Took us together at least 5 years of gathering information and putting together. And we were rewarded because within 2 weeks of this book hitting the store shelves, we were number 4 on the Globe Mail bestseller list of Canadian nonfiction. And so that just blew our socks off us. And then to top that off, Just last month, we were the recipient of the 2025 American Horticultural Society Book Award. They give out three of those a year, and we were one of them. And so that was quite a feather in our cap as well. So why this book? I mean, there's lots of native plant books. What's different about this one, and why is it a good book to have? Well, what we wanted was something that gave all of the pertinent growing information in one place. Uh, so it starts out with a 20-page introduction that discusses definitions, tells you how to use the book, including the symbols that we use. It gets into scientific nomenclature of plants. It describes our range maps. And then there's a whole section on propagation terms and techniques, and even covers a bit about species at risk. Every one of the 150 species of plants has a photo of the leaf, of the flower, the whole plant, and the seed head. And so here is an example of Asclepias tuberosa, which is a common name butterfly milkweed. And the reason we go with scientific names is because some plants have multiple common names, but they only have one scientific name. So that's what we chose to do alphabetically. And that also keeps all of the Asclepias together in the book. So all of the milkweeds are close together and you can compare them. Um, so those are pictures that each plant has. We also have a range map showing where it's native. And this is one of the things that is unique about our book is that that shaded gray area on that image is where butterfly milkweed is native, or considered native at least. Some of those knowing exactly where it was native is difficult because our definition for native is pre-European arrival. And so we just went with the most information we could find and had it vetted by a number of very knowledgeable botanists and field ecologists. We also provide an at-a-glance set of graphics that show light and moisture requirements, propagation information, and some key values of the plants. So in this case, you can see that up here we have this plant requires full sun and it likes medium to dry soil. You can see over here that it's a good cut plant, it's salt tolerant, it's good for bees, butterflies, caterpillars, and even hummingbirds. And over here, these symbols are explained in the introduction, but this is how to propagate it. And so in this case, it means that it needs 60 or 30 days of cold, moist stratification for the seeds to propagate, and that you can actually take root cuttings, although I do know that that is a bit of a challenge, but it is possible. Here's another example of a cutleaf toothwort, and it shows here on this graphic that it takes full shade to part shade, and it wants moist to medium soils. It shows that it's also a good cut flower, it's good for bees and for caterpillars, and that the seeds over here, M means they require moisture. You got to keep them moist, don't let them dry out. And the D means you can divide this plant when it's mature. Uh, what else is in the book? I mentioned the scientific name, common names. There's even an index of common names. If you know it by that, you can look it up if you don't know the scientific name. We give a plant description plus a description of it in the garden, and those two parts in particular are Sean's main contribution, and I brought him on board with the book because that was something that I knew he would do really well, is describe how these plants look in your garden. We talk a bit about whether it's good for beginners or intermediate or advanced gardeners, and in this book, almost everything is good for beginners. The lifespan of the plant, the light levels and needs of the plant, how big it gets, what color it is, and whether or not it's fragrant. We'll talk about the foliage. Is it fragrant? Does it have a showy fruit? And so on. A variety of things, value to wildlife. The other thing that we include is a list of butterflies and or moth species that each plant is a host for. Not all of them are hosts for butterflies or moths, but quite a few of them are, and this will show you exactly which insect species you're growing this plant for. And for those who still like to grow by hardiness zone, we've included that information as well. We also tell you whether it's a species at risk or not, in which jurisdictions it is within our region, and most importantly, we tell you how to propagate the plant. We also have appendices at the back that talk about landscape uses, soil types, and again, propagation. Also a chart that, again, Sean was mostly responsible for, all about the seed collection and preparation. And so with that, I am now going to turn the show over to Sean because he's going to tell you how to propagate these. It's all yours, Sean.
All right, thank you, Rick. So, do you want me to share my screen or do you just want to
You
change
just
it?
tell me when you want to advance. I can do
Okay.
that. It's up now.
All right, so how do we grow our own native plants? Well, it's very rewarding to collect your own seeds and watch them grow. It's also much cheaper than going out and buying a whole bunch of potted plants, but it does require a lot more knowledge, time, and experience to get right. So I'm just going to go over how we can collect different types of native seeds and how we can germinate them based on their different germination needs. Next slide. So the first thing we need to discuss here is ethical seed collection. So you can harvest your seeds from a cultivated space or a garden, or you can harvest them from the wild. Now, if you're harvesting them from the wild, you want to make sure that you're not taking more than 10% of seed from a given area. This is just to ensure that there's enough left over for wildlife to eat and for the plant to reproduce. Definitely don't want to collect from rare or endangered species. Instead, you want to buy those seeds from trusted suppliers. And it's also ideal to use seeds that are collected as close to your garden as possible. And this is because they're going to be much better suited to your specific ecoregion or a growing area. Next slide. So how do we know when our seeds are ready to collect? Of course, different plants are going to have different types of seed heads. Some are fluffy, some produce capsules, some hold their seeds within flesh or fruit, and some have dry exposed seeds. So our collection methods are going to differ slightly based on these different seed head types. Now, there's different indicators to look for depending on the plant. So typically, you want to harvest the seeds just before they're fully ripe and then allow them to cure or finish ripening inside. This is because by doing this, they're going to be safe from predators or they'll be safe from being blown away by the wind before you can actually get to them. Next slide, please. So plants with fluffy seed heads, such as asters and goldenrods, or the ironweed you see on screen here, they're ready to collect when their seed heads are just starting to become fluffy. Now you can test for readiness by just gently pinching and pulling on the seed fluff. If the seeds come out with fairly easily with little resistance, then they're ready. If they put up some resistance and they don't really want to give to your pulling, then they're not quite ready yet, so just give them a little bit of time. Once the seed heads are ready, you want to remove them from the plant with shears. Just remove the whole seed head, and then you can place them in a paper bag in a dry room temperature area for about a week. And at this point, the seeds would have fully ripened, and you can shake the bag and the seeds are they should easily dislodge from the seed heads, and you can throw away the stem and you'll just have all of the seeds and the fluff left behind. And you can go further and clean the fluff off the seeds. I find for the smaller scale sowing, it's really not necessary. You can just sow them with the fluff on. Next slide, please. Now, for plants with berries or flesh around their seeds, such as spikenard or trillium, jack in the pulpit, or even the spice bush you see on screen here, you want to seeds. Now, viable seeds usually sink in water, so we can use this to our advantage by taking the berries and placing them in a plastic tub or a mason jar, fill it up with just enough water to cover the berries, and then cover it with a lid and just let it sit there on the counter for about 7 to 10 days, preferably in a dark room temperature area. Now, over this time, the flesh around the seeds is going to ferment into essentially a liquidy pulp and become separated from the seeds. So after about 7 to 10 days, just give the jar a bit of a shake, and you should notice the flesh and the skin and the pulp is completely separated, and all of the viable seeds will be sinking to the bottom. So at this point, you can gently pour off the water and pulp, leaving the seeds at the bottom. You may have to repeat this a few times, filling up with more water and just to keep pouring off everything that's not a seed. But by the end of this, you should have fairly clean seeds. And this fermenting process is not necessary, but it does actually improve germination in my experience. And it makes separating the seeds from the flesh and skin much easier. There are other methods, such as putting the seeds in a blender where the blender blades have duct tape wrapped around them so they're not so sharp, and that could do a very similar job in a much faster time. Next slide. All right, so now we have capsules and pods. Now these are typically the easiest seeds to harvest because ripe seed pods release their seed quite readily. Now the trick here is to harvest the seed pods while they're just slightly underripe so that they don't ripen outdoors and release their seeds before you have a chance to collect them. The sundial lupin you see on screen here, if you wait until those are ripe, you're going to miss out because when they dry out and get ripe, they actually launch their seeds out. Now, plants that produce seeds in a capsule, such as blue flag iris or hairy beard tongue, Canada lily, so they're ready when the pods are mostly brown and dry. A lot of the times they'll still be slightly yellow. So just like what you see on screen here with the sundial lupin. Now at this point, you can pick the pods and just let them sit in a dry room temperature area for about a week where they're going to fully dry out and ripen. And at this point, they should split open fairly easily, or they might just do it on their own. So at this point, you can also place them in a hard sealed container, like a Tupperware container, and just shake the dried seed heads, and they should release most of their seeds. Now, if the seed pods don't open on their own, you can gently crush them, which is going to separate the seeds from the capsules, at which point you can winnow away the debris and pick out the seeds. Next slide. Now, some seeds cannot be allowed to dry out, as Rick mentioned a bit earlier. So examples of this may include many spring ephemerals, such as bloodroot, wild ginger, and trilliums. You can see some bloodroot seeds on screen there. Now, in this case, you want to keep in mind that the seeds should be planted within 24 hours of harvesting. Now, this is just to keep them moist, but if you can't do it within that time frame, it is okay to place the seeds in a sealed container with a slightly moist paper towel, and you can maybe have up to a week at that point before you can sow them. But it's really, the longer you leave it, the less your germination will be. All right, next slide. So let's talk about germination needs. So the seeds of many native plants have these built-in dormancy mechanisms that's there to protect them from germinating before frosts or before a winter or prevent them from germinating in times of drought. Now, in the wild, seeds will lie dormant over the winter months until the proper conditions for growth occur in the springtime. This is usually a result of meeting a certain number of days of cold temperatures. And this process is called cold moist stratification. And many of our native plants require anywhere from 10 to 120 days, or sometimes even more, of cold, moist conditions before they're going to germinate. Now, some seeds need no prior treatment. They can simply be sown in a warm, moist location and they'll germinate. Many native grasses don't require treatment. Some perennials do. Now, examples include bottlebrush grass, little blue stem, wild bergamot, or eastern prickly pear cactus. You can just sow these plants outdoors in the early spring or even into the early summer if you're kind of late to the party, and they're still going to germinate. Now, in addition to stratification, some seeds have additional. Next slide, please. Now, some, such as those of blue lobelia, fireweed, or pearly everlasting, are very, very small, and they actually need light to germinate to break dormancy. Now, seeds requiring this treatment should only be sown on the surface of the soil with no soil covering them. So what you want to do is simply sprinkle the seeds evenly on the soil surface and just pat them down very gently with your hands. Now, if you're growing in outdoor beds, you can sow the seed on a level surface, cover them with a single layer of burlap or maybe some old screen netting. And as soon as you see them starting to germinate, you can remove this cover. This is just going to stop them from drying out while they're establishing. Now make sure with any seed that requires surface sowing, whenever you go to water them just to keep them moist, make sure you're watering them with a very fine mist or you're going to wash away the seeds or they're going to sink too deep into the soil and it'll be too dark for them to germinate. Next slide, please. Now some seeds such as the sundial lupin we just saw or New Jersey tea, they require or they just benefit from scarification prior to germination. Now, scarification is the process of mechanically weakening the very tough seed coat in order to allow water to penetrate it, which helps speed up germination. Now, you can scarify seeds by just gently rubbing them between two sheets of medium grit sandpaper. Now, the goal here is just to gently abrade the tough seed coat. You don't want to crush the seed or you don't want to wear them straight down to the delicate interior. Now, scarification should be done before stratification if stratification is required. And then if you sow your seeds outside in the fall or the winter time, usually the freeze thaw action of the winter and spring months is enough to break down the seed coat, and scarification will not be necessary, but it is definitely helpful to certain seeds. All right, next slide. All right, so onto stratification. So how do we stratify our seeds? Now we can do this naturally or artificially. Winter sowing is the term used for cold stratifying your seeds by sowing them outside in containers over the winter months, just to mimic natural conditions so that the seeds can stratify naturally and germinate in the spring. Now, winter sowing is very easy. You can take pots or seedling trays like what you see on screen. You can fill them up with potting mix and a little bit of fertilizer or compost. Then you sow your seeds in them. Now just place those outside, preferably cover them with wire mesh to prevent rodents from eating them during the winter. And basically all you do now is wait until spring, and the seeds should germinate when they're ready to grow. Now, this method can be done in old milk jugs, which will act as a mini greenhouse to get the seeds going a little bit sooner, but this isn't entirely necessary. At my nursery, we sow the seeds, as you see on screen here, and just let nature do all of the hard work. Now, you can also stratify your seeds artificially in the fridge. You can place them in moistened play sand or maybe a coffee filter, place them into a sealed Ziploc bag, and then place it in the fridge for the required amount of days that the seeds need for cold, moist stratification. Now, once they reach the necessary length of time, they should be ready to sow outside in pots in the early spring. where they'll be ready to germinate whenever the weather's right. Now, this method is equally as effective as sowing outside, and it does have the benefit of giving you more control over your seeds, as in protecting them from predators and stopping them from maybe germinating too easily if it gets have a warm spell in early spring. Now that's just a quick overview of how we can start native plants from seed. Each plant, as I mentioned, has its own specific indicator of when its seeds are ready. And the seeds all have their own specific germination needs. So you really have to check out the needs for each plant that you're germinate them according to those needs. Now, here are some easy native plants to grow from seed and to sow. Now, this one on screen here is pink milkweed. It requires about 30 days of cold, moist stratification. It typically has a fairly good germination rate, and it thrives in full sun to part sun gardens in average to moist soils. It's a great beginner plant for winter sowing and for actually growing in your garden. All right, next. Then here we have zigzag goldenrod. It requires about 60 days of cold, moist stratification, and the seeds are very tiny. So this is one that needs light to germinate. So just simply sprinkle them on top of the soil when you're ready to sow them and just pat it down gently. This is a great non-aggressive goldenrod for shady gardens, and it even tolerates dry shade under big trees. All right, next. And here we have little blue stem. Now, it doesn't require any pre-treatment to grow. You can simply sow it in a warm area, anywhere from spring to midsummer. Just keep the soil moist and they should sprout. Now, little blue stem is a beautiful clump-forming grass that thrives in dry, sunny sites and is a staple in prairie and meadow gardens. So that's all I have, and I think I'll pass it over to Rick for the next slides.
Hey, thanks, Sean. So what I have here is just a picture of our propagation table out of the back of the book that I wanted to just point out a few things on. So across the top of this, you can see NT, CL, WC, and so on. So these codes down the left side are all the plants in the book. And these codes mean no treatment required, NT. C means it needs cold stratification. And then in that column, you'll see the number of days that each plant requires to be cold stratified if it does. L means it needs light. WC means it needs a period of warmth and then a period of followed by a period of cold. And these are typically plants that are early spring plants. So they, in the wild, they will drop their seeds in the spring. They'll have the summer delay there getting warm, and then they get cold stratification through the winter and germinate the next year. The next column, CWC, that's cold, warm, cold. And that is a plant that in the wild often will take 2 years before they germinate. So this will be plants like trilliums and so on that require 2 periods of cold with a warm period in between. And you can mimic this by taking it from the fridge, leaving it at room temperature for a while, and then putting it back into the fridge for a while. Not always as effective as letting nature do it, but that's a way you can cheat. S means scarification, so these are seeds that have a hard seed coat. And M on the end means that these are seeds that have to stay moist. If they dry out, the seeds quickly become inviable. So other propagation techniques in this table means D is you can divide these plants. LYR means you can layer them, which is simply putting a section of stem down, pinning it to the soil, and then usually roots will form where that is touching the soil. CR and CS are root cuttings and stem cuttings each. And so that's the kind of information that we wanted to provide everybody so that it would make it a lot easier for starting your own. And what I want to do now is just wrap up with a few images from the Grow Me Instead guide of the plants that are suggested instead of invasives. And these, if you see the picture of our book in it, it means that plant is in our book, and you can find out all about the plant there. So instead of growing periwinkle, grow wild geranium. On my garden, this loves anywhere from full sun to mostly shade, actually. And it is a beautiful late spring flower in my garden, and will fill in nicely for you. Uh, Instead of growing lily of the valley, which many of us have either in some time purchased or bought a property with it on and know how hard it is to get rid of, grow star-flowered Solomon seal. It has a very similar look, but it's native and it has a lot of benefit for our local wildlife, whereas the lily of the valley doesn't. One cool thing about this plant is that the berries that it produces are actually edible, and they're quite tasty. Beautiful white flower. It's not a plant for a very small space because it will spread and become a dense mat. But in my way of thinking, this would be a perfect bank stabilization species. Instead of goutweed, replace it with large leaf aster. In my garden, I love my large leaf aster. It's very consistently full of lots of flowers. It grows in full shade to part shade. It even takes a fair bit of sun, in the morning sun at least, and it creates a lovely ground cover, very slow spreading, but it will eventually spread out, both self-seeding and with rhizomes. A wonderful shade plant, instead of winter creeper, grow creeping foam flower. This is Tiarella stolonifera. It's had a scientific name change recently, but this has beautiful white flowers and grows nicely under sugar maples and in other shady areas. It's a nice spring flowering plant, as is Virginia waterleaf, which you can grow instead of running euonymus or any of the euonymuses. This has a lovely white flower that turns purpley color. It's called water leaf because you can see that the leaves on the right look like they've got water spots on them, and eventually they will fill in an area. They like a little bit more moisture than some of the plants, but these plants you see in this image are growing under sugar maples in my garden. The only time there's a problem with them is in a really dry year. They will kind of disappear, as many spring ephemerals do, but in a wet year they stay green pretty much all summer long. Another thing you can grow instead of English ivy is strawberries. Now, this happens to be woodland strawberry. It looks very similar to Fragaria virginiensis, which is your common wild strawberry. Um, this one likes a little more shade. The common strawberry likes more sun. Tasty little fruits on them, beautiful white flowers. And I was just out in my garden this morning and I see my first strawberry blossoms are open now. So won't be long till the squirrels get a feed, because I never seem to get them early enough. Instead of bugleweed, try growing wild ginger. You can see the really unusual looking flower. We often don't see it because it kind of faces down. It's pollinated by beetles and other insects like that. And this plant makes a nice dense ground cover. The moister your soil, the better, but I have it growing under my sugar maples as well in dry sandy soil, and it doesn't thrive there, but it survives okay. But in the back of my garden where I have a lot more moisture, it's growing under black walnuts and doing just beautifully back there. Another one, Canada anemone. As Claudette says, you want to establish your garden first before you put this in, because it will take over if it's given the free rein to do so. But once you've got some other things in place, it'll kind of just mind its own business and grow wherever there's some openings. One thing I love about this is I have a spot under my sugar maples that nothing would grow for whatever reason. And I planted some of this there last year. I actually moved it from my other planting, and I see this spring that it's coming up. So it's a tough plant and will grow where a lot of things wouldn't. And I would suggest that this might be something, if you've got one of those horrible Norway maples on your boulevard, this might be a great thing to grow underneath that. And the dreaded daylily can be replaced with Michigan lilies. This is a beautiful orange flower. It gets about chest tall in my garden and has these gorgeous flowers. I've planted three of them 3 years ago, and I see I've got about 8 or 9 coming up this year. So they will spread slowly, but they're just to me they're a beautiful native species that we can grow here. And then instead of daylilies, another thing you could grow would be black-eyed Susans. These are gorgeous. They bloom for a long time, all through the mid and late summer and into the fall. A great annual slash biennial that can keep your garden looking nice for quite a while. And there's so many more that we can grow, but that's all the ones I have for now. So there we go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rick and Sean. That was very information dense and lots of great information there. Um, we have a number of questions. I don't know if all three of you have time maybe to go past 1:30 by like 5, 10 minutes. We can get to as many questions as we can. So the first question here, I'm trying to grow native plants along the banks of a Niagara region river that floods multiple times every spring, sometimes after dormancy is broken. Most things I planted last year, like cardinal flower, blue lobelia, do not seem to have survived. The marsh marigold did. Are there other low height options you can recommend?
I can answer part of that. I think if the person who asked the question can consider larger and deeper rooted plants, that might be needed in that bank. And you could use things like willows, dogwoods, alders, and certain grasses like blue stems. There's also ways of stabilizing a bank physically using some biodegradable construction in essence. So I'm going to put in the Q&A just a link to an article that Kathy wrote about this, which might be helpful to the poster. And maybe Rick can, I know Rick mentioned a plant for stabilizing a bank as well.
Yeah, so that uh, star-flowered Solomon seal, I have never tried it along a river where it gets flooded, but it does create a nice stable bank once it gets established, and it doesn't take it that long to get established. But there are other plants like uh, Virginia waterleaf, but also Canada waterleaf that I often find growing down near where I live along a stream that gets flooded every spring. And yet this stuff survives through the flooding and comes up. And the cool thing about the Canada waterleaf, or sometimes called large leaf waterleaf, is that it has large leaves, but it also has a large ball of white flowers that kind of hide under the leaf, and they're beautiful. So that's an option. Cardinal flower just might need to get a long enough stretch to get established because they will take a fair bit of flooding as well. And unless the soil is actually getting washed away with them, then once the roots get established, although they are a short-lived perennial, so you might have to plant several of them in order to get enough seed to keep new plants coming. Sean, you got some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'd consider anything that spreads by rhizomes. I know anything that spreads by or makes a lot of seed and drops a lot of seed will help keep the ground covered. I know Virginia rye is often found in along riversides, growing quite prolifically. So that would be a good option. Even some sedges. There's a lot of different sedges that thrive in those kind of floodplain conditions, and they typically have dense root systems. And yeah, Canada anemone might even be a good one for that spot.
Great. Excellent. There's another question here about disposal. So I was mentioning using a dark plastic bag for baking the seeds and roots. Can you use clear bags to have maximum burn by the sun? So People can have used clear bags as well for to put in invasive plant material and dispose of it, but it's the black material is really like helps to solarize the material and render it unviable. So it's usually better to do a black plastic tarp. And then another question here. Seed collection or cultivars. How sure can one be that the seeds grown on the plant have not been cross-pollinated by neighborhood non-pure plants, especially those that are prone to cross-pollinating, red columbine and native lupin, for example? Is it better not to use seeds and use plant division instead? It's a great question, yeah.
I'm going to leave this seed question to Rick and Sean.
My
Yeah,
thinking, yeah, Sean, you
go
go.
ahead, Rick.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
I was going to say a lot of cultivars are sterile, so that probably don't have to worry about that. I'm not too sure what else to add though.
Yeah, I think the columbine and the lupins are two of the more problematic ones that way. And for that reason, I buy strictly from people like Sean and other growers who have valid seed sources. They know where the seed's coming from, and so they're going to have the true species and not worrying about whether the thing is cross-pollinated or not.
And what is the correct medium to grow natives from seeds? I have several seed packets from northern wildflowers that have been cold stratified that need to be planted soon. Would seedling soil mix work for this?
Before Sean answers that, I'm going to throw in, make sure wildflowers are native species. Most packets of wildflowers are not. And a lot of places sell them as even what you would think would be a reputable source. And when you look at the Latin names on the back, you'll find that they are not, often not even native to Canada, let alone Ontario. So that was my first caution on that. But if you do have native seeds, Sean,
Yeah, it's a very good point, Rick. Um, yeah, seedling mix will work fine. Any kind of pro mix or potting mix, as long as it's not too coarse, it'll be okay for the seeds. You just don't want anything too coarse because it's going to inhibit the seeds from kind of germinating and pushing up through the soil. Now, especially for the very fine seeds that need to be surface sown, the seedling mixes are typically better because it's a much finer substrate. I just don't use soil straight from the garden and put that in a pot because it's often going to have weed seeds and it's too dense and doesn't have the right porosity and drainage when it's in a pot. So if you're growing in pots, definitely stick with a good quality potting soil.
That's a good point. I'm finding propagating Rosa blanda from hips difficult. Any tips? Or Rosa blanda?
Hmm. Not 100% sure off the top of my head, but you might need to scarify them. And I know a lot of or some seeds have germination inhibitors, so you want to make sure you clean the flesh off perfectly. But you'd have to look up the very specific germination needs for that one.
And how would you scarify? Would you like,
So just with very fine sandpaper, just gently rub the seeds between two sheets of sandpaper. Some seeds will even, you can scarify them with hot water. That'll be enough to break down the seed coat. I know
Sean,
you can,
is Rosa blanda something you could propagate from a stem cutting?
definitely.
yeah.
I have Rosa blanda growing in my garden, and you can take root cuttings because it pops up 10 feet away from the original plant from rhizomes that slip under the grass. So that's one of the plants that I actually grow in a half barrel that I've cut off and sunk into the ground and put the topsoil back in and planted my smooth rose in there because it's a very aggressive spreader.
Right, excellent. What does the 90 mean in the cold stratification column as opposed to 90, which is 90 days? That was one of the slides. And I don't remember which.
So the anything in the cold stratification, the numbers means the days. Some are in brackets, and that is simply a matter of those that are in brackets are this is what's recommended by some sources, but not by others. So we said it may benefit from 90 days, but may not necessarily be required. But if it's just a straight number in there, then that's how many days you need to cold stratify it.
That's a good question. A question for Kathy and Claudette. How do we master gardeners counteract invasive fatigue? Some gardeners can be quite hostile when the topic comes up.
That's a great question, actually. I think you have to take people where they are, and you have to understand that no matter what you say, they may not believe you. One thing I try to do is say, you know, this plant is invasive, and people say, no, it's not. I try to make clear this is not my opinion. This is based on scientific fact and these threat assessments, and I will try and give some support there. But people have to be ready to hear the message. And what I've found in being patient and trying to take people where they are and making that one small change in your garden is that people are listening. Kathy and I and the whole moderator crew on our Facebook page is seeing huge changes. I would say just 5 years ago, which isn't long, people would post about burning bush and we would recommend, well, maybe you want to remove that, and they would get very hostile. You know, not only the person who said they were planting it, but everyone else. Like, why would you tell people to do that? But now, when someone mentions an invasive plant, the entire forum kind of jumps on, sometimes really aggressively, which is not necessarily the best way. It's never the best way of moving people on their journey to a native plant garden. You can also, if someone asks me about butterfly bush and they don't, you know, they don't want to hear that it's invasive, what I try to sell them on is that butterfly bush, sure, it does support butterflies for nectar resources, but if you want to have more butterflies, you'll never have them with just butterfly bush. In order to have butterflies, you need to plant New Jersey tea or golden Alexanders or, you know, something that actually grows butterflies like milkweed. And I just try to seduce them in small ways. Like if you want to be happier, you know, have birds in your garden, that type of thing. So that research that's been done can be very attractive. And don't lose faith, don't lose hope. Things are changing. I see positive change all the time, and reward people for the, you know, positive things. Like post, if you're doing social media, post something with like there's the superhero, that you're a superhero for fighting native plants or invasive plants. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There is a more of a shift in those. I think those Facebook groups, social media is definitely helping with that. Um, Christine, offer hope and
I think Kathy is answering the question.
okay, that one's okay. Uh, what is the difference between USDA and Canada hardiness zones?
The way the number is calculated is the main difference. So the USDA is strictly based on a minimum temperature that the plant will survive. Whereas in Canada, we must have a bunch of mathematicians in the department because it's a huge complex formula that takes in wind, it takes in rainfall, it takes in cold temperatures, it takes in all kinds of things. And fortunately for those of us, at least in Southern Ontario, the numbers here are very close to the USDA numbers. Once we start getting into the Rockies and places way up north, then the numbers start to change, vary quite a bit between the two. But for most of Southern Ontario, whether you use the Canadian numbers or the American numbers, they'll tell you pretty much the same thing. The boundaries are going to be reasonably close. And I think that's almost coincidence as much as anything else for here. But we've used the USDA because that's if you go to a nursery and they have a plant and it says it's hardy to zone 5 or 5B, that's invariably going to be a USDA hardiness zone. And so people are familiar with that. The other problem is our book also covers the states, and the Canadian numbers aren't developed for the states. So we would have had to have two different sets of numbers if we tried to divide it out.
Yeah, great. And then question, can we get copies of Grow Me instead to hand out to receptive neighbors? So we don't have any printed copies, unfortunately, at the moment. We typically tell people to download online. The guide is undergoing an update, so there may be a possible printing run during that time, but it's going to probably be at least a year before that time. And there were a few questions in the chat, so I want to make sure I get to a few of them before we finish. Here's one. I have a cultivar of Cicericium montanum that looks identical to the native, but tends to grow in clumps rather than individually. How can I determine if it's functional or not, like the white nativar of Asclepias incarnata?
I would say that if you're seeing pollinators on it, because there isn't a lot that feeds on the leaves of blue-eyed grass anyway. And so my blue-eyed grass, which is montanum, I think it's montanum, or maybe it's angustifolium, whichever one, it tends to self-seed uh, right at the base of the plant, and so it looks like it's coming up in a clump. But they're actually all separate plants that are there that have just self-seeded densely. Yours might be doing that, unless you know for a fact that it was a cultivar. But if you're seeing pollinators on it, I'd say you're in good shape.
What part of Ontario does Sean provide seedlings?
So we're based out of Alton, which is just outside of Orangeville. So, I mean, we'll supply to anywhere in Southern Ontario.
Like,
It's worth the drive to Alton.
Yes, it is.
give me 1 second. Um, how much leaf litter in inches or centimeters can I leave on my gardens from last fall?
So I did put some information in the chat about that. Kind of depends on what kind of leaves they are, because oak leaves tend to, smother plants, and it takes them a long time to decompose, whereas something like a willow leaf or a smaller leaf will decompose more quickly. It also depends on the number of leaves you have, and it depends on the size of the plant. So obviously a larger plant can support more leaves than a smaller plant. So you sort of have to play it by ear with what you have in your garden. Certainly, if you put too heavy an amount of leaves on the crown of certain plants, it can smother them and it can cause some harm. So if you can depending again on how your garden is, you could maybe surround certain plants with the leaves and put a lighter amount on top in the fall to weather the winter into the spring. But if we think about our woodland plants, they live in the woods and the leaves fall on them all the time and they survive quite nicely. So think of that as well. So there are a number of different factors. If you have way too many leaves and you can't deal with them, then an alternative is just to put them in leaf bags and store them somewhere in your garden. You'll get great leaf mold, which you can actually use in container gardening or in your garden. So there are workarounds to that, but it's one of those depends questions.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll do
and
one. Yeah, Rick.
I was going to say, in my garden, under the sugar maples, I leave the leaves a good 6 inches deep in the fall, and they tend to disappear. And all of those plants that are in there are woodland species, and they come up through it with no problem. My other gardens, I put leaves in there. In fact, the wind often blows it off the grass and into the tall stems, which I leave anyway. And so, in some of those plants aren't woodland species. And so in the spring, I will lightly take a fork and just lift and fluff up the leaves that are on those. Do it early enough that you're not damaging any plants that might be trying to come up through it. And I actually don't put my leaves in a bag because I'm always worried, am I going to put a caterpillar or an adult butterfly that's overwintering them into that bag as well? I just have I'm lucky I have a spot near the back of my property. It's actually behind my redbud tree, and I throw my excess leaves there and just kind of spread them out. And so over time, those rot down, but then hopefully any insects that happen to be in it are going to survive that move.
Okay. And one final question before we finish. Chop and drop versus leaving stems from last summer. If we cut 15 centimeters and the top row, which one is better for insects? Could we cut down and leave standing or laying down the stems in the quiet corner of the yard?
Again, it's one of those depends questions. It depends on how large your yard is. I tend to, so the new information I saw from Heather Holmes was as soon as you see bees flying in your garden, that's the time to cut back your stems. They need to be cut back so the bees can actually use the open end of the stem for the stem nesting bees. And I think Rick or Sean can correct me. I thought it was around 12 inches. I do it about knee height, just as a reminder. If there are way too many stems, and sometimes what I do is I remove those stems from the garden and I'll stick them against the fence or the wall. So they're not removed from the garden per se, they're just removed from the site if there are a lot. The other thing that Heather Holmes has said very clearly is that yes, you can cut them in the spring, but you have to leave them standing for an entire year so that next year when the bees that are growing in there, they need to emerge in the spring. So you can't at one point, you should leave them as long as you can, is what I'm trying to say. I just tend to put them against the fence sometimes, and that works quite well. I don't know what Rick or Sean has to add there. They do something more.
That's exactly how I do it as well.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer.
Awesome. So with that, thank
Vicki,
you so much. Oh,
Vicki, I wanted to mention that I put the Halton list of nurseries in the chat as well. It's a little
oh,
different in that it includes native plant nurseries, but also non-native nurseries. And we have a new category with Red Hearts, which are nurseries which have pledged not to sell invasive plants. So I think that's a big win. And I'm hoping to add more nurseries with Red Hearts there. So
awesome.
thanks everyone for making a difference. We're really changing the climate of native plant gardening.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks Claudette, Rick, and Sean for this great webinar. And everyone, enjoy your spring and gardening.
Thanks. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yep,
Bye.
I'm heading back out into the garden right now.
Sounds perfect.